I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zaz Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be talking about vehicles in TTRPG combat and some of the challenges that arise from running them.
That's right. So why are vehicles rough spots in TTRPG combat? Well, I mean, when you're playing a tabletop RPG and you're not in combat, you just want to do overland travel, it's easy enough to use vehicles. You can just say, hey, there's a boat. If you want to pay for passage on someone else's boat, it's usually about this much per mile. If you want to buy a boat, it costs this much to buy it. And boats go at about this rate per hour. And with, if you have enough sailors on it to go in shifts, you could just keep going throughout the day.
And maybe things get a little more complicated in terms of, hey, this type of terrain is better for this type of conveyance. Or you can only go from, this type of conveyance will only take you along the water, and then you're deciding, do I want to go along the water to get to this place where I then get on a horse or something like that. But overall, because it's fully abstracted away and it's just a matter of, time and money and not ticky-tack combat stuff, it's usually pretty easy to resolve.
And it's not just because of the fact that it's a matter of time and money, but the reason why vehicles work so well in overland travel is that they match our narrative expectation of vehicles that we have from books and TV shows and movies, where a vehicle will be a way to get somewhere, and it might be a way to get somewhere faster in a plot point. It might be something that breaks down, or that there's some kind of plot point where there's an issue with the vehicle, but that's sort of the way it works. Even in some older TV shows, they would just kind of warp you to the next place, and they would cut the part of arrival. Although in some other ones, they would always show them driving and getting there and opening the door. And then in modern shows, it cuts even more often than that, and even sometimes takes away the vehicles. The point is, though, that vehicles do what they need to do for the story when it comes to getting to places.
But didn't they find, or I remember something about some kind of study that it was easier for people to understand the transitions in the plot if they show people in a car or something like that.
Correct. In between. That's why it kind of went back and forth, but still a lot of modern shows cut it anyway to make the episode be able to fit more things, because it's not as much is going on when they show that arrival. Whereas it was more often in old shows that they would always show them sort of getting there so that you could see them arriving. So the problem you come into with vehicles in tabletop RPG combat, because people ask this a lot. They're like, what's going on? So many tabletop RPGs don't even include rules for vehicles, and you just have to make them up if you're using them in combat. Others have rules for vehicles that are considered to be arcane or tough to use, or to be rules that people often don't want to use. And the problem that vehicles have in combat is that using them in combat in a way that merges well with tabletop RPGs, tactical combat systems, for most tabletop RPGs that have tactical combat, does not fit well with the narrative we have of being in a vehicle.
Yeah. For vehicles are, by their very nature and why people choose to use them, vehicles are often much larger and heavier than people. So if a vehicle runs into a person, that person's going to have a very bad time. They're often much faster than people. So if you had a vehicle that's moving as fast as vehicles reasonably could, your characters would have trouble keeping up with them. They're also often fairly tough and resilient.
They sometimes completely cover up everybody who's inside of them. In some stories, even ones that are set in fantasy worlds where characters for some reason have some kind of heavy-duty vehicle, it's all about them just kind of auto-winning fights by running everything over in the vehicle. But not only that, even if you have a situation where the vehicle is not something that is doing some kind of gamist issue, like the ones Linda's was talking about, where the vehicle just kind of wins it, there's narrative issues in that games often abstract movement. Now, some tabletop RPGs might not, but ones like D&D and Pathfinder, and especially ones that are less complex than those, often abstract movement such that you have a sprinting person and they're just running and they can immediately turn around, turn corners in some wild, outrageous way, even if they're a horse going on some kind of cavalry gallop. Unless they have a specific charge ability that says they have to be in a straight line, they can run around, back up. But when you get to vehicles, that's when it just gets so jarring to have the idea that you have a car moving at 100 miles an hour, and then it suddenly turns 270 degrees, and then 5 feet later turns another 270 degrees, or backs up immediately from 100 miles per hour this way to 100 miles per hour the exact opposite.
It stops exactly in the right point despite having traveled a pretty long distance in 6 seconds.
So, even possibly because of the fact that most people don't ride on galloping horses, it's easier for a lot of people who in their head are like kind of picturing what's going on to accept it with your sprinting orc or your galloping horse than with this out-of-control vehicle that is suddenly doing those things. And that leads to games often having in-combat vehicle rules that include headings when they may not have a heading or facing for any of the other characters in the game, that include some kind of momentum in the direction so that you have to turn around and you can't just go backwards on the dime. And that include other complications like that involve driving the vehicle, because part of the fiction and the fantasy of being on a vehicle is you're an awesome driver and you're doing all of these tricks, whereas the fantasy of being an orc who's charging your enemies does not include that whole necessarily that sort of virtuosic tendency of the driver's so cool, look at how the driver was able to do this spin.
Yeah.
That's not part of the wish fulfillment necessarily. Maybe I can jump 50 feet up in the air or something that makes you perform a superhuman feat that other people wouldn't be able to do.
But that's going to be something that you build more to have your character towards, not something that everyone's going to expect to be able to do.
Yes. So part of the fantasy wouldn't just be oh yeah, let's see if my orc who's running around can spin in a circle and go this direction. Because even if that was successful, nobody would be really that excited about it. If it was unsuccessful, people would just get frustrated. Whereas with a vehicle, sometimes someone wants to show off that they're such a good driver, and they have the idea that they can do these tricks while driving that other people can't do.
Yeah. The larger the vehicle, the weirder it gets. If you assuming you have to care about the positions of the individual PCs within the vehicle. So, if you have a giant train or a massive truck, and then you turn it on a dime and it was going like this, and then it goes swing around here, and the people who are in the front barely move, but the people in the back move large numbers of squares and things like that. It can get stranger and stranger. So oftentimes when vehicles are appearing in TTRPG combat, then the combats are designed so that it is generally structured as vehicle versus vehicle. And then the vehicles can have offensive and defensive statistics that are balanced against each other.
That is one way to do it. I wouldn't even say generally, because you never know what is going to go on with vehicle systems, and they tend to have a rocky reception no matter what. Now, when we mentioned this entire topic, there was an idea in our Discord that was, what if your entire RPG was about vehicles? You had a vehicle as part of your character sheet. That was part of your stats. When your vehicle got to 0, you're out of the fight because you have to be racing. All the monsters, if there are any, are able to keep up with vehicles and fight vehicles, and all of the opponents who aren't giant monsters are in vehicles. You could do that, and that would actually, honestly, probably work better than any of the things we're going to talk about now. Now, Linda first talked about, what if you have a special mode where you're only fighting against vehicles, or maybe there's something like the Super Smash Bros. Level where everybody is jumping around on top of vehicles, and their vehicles happen to be there, but you're not really about the vehicles.
In that case, that's more about, you have one battle map, and then you have a second smaller map on top of it that you're moving relative to the ground. And that may matter if you have, say, multiple vehicles that might be moving up and back and past each other, but you're not then necessarily going to be having at the same time dealing with the vehicles are attacking each other. You might have a PC who's spending some actions to steer the vehicle, and so it's kind of like you're busy steering the location of the battle map, and then other folks are fighting, or they might be able to get close enough to board the other vehicle.
Yes. Now that has its own concerns. One of which is anytime you're in a tabletop RPG, if you create a new mode of, especially a new mode of combat, it can lead to a major friction with your player base, especially if you have a player base that is comfortable with and good at the usual combat system, and you've now created a new combat system that they do not have the same system mastery with. They will grow frustrated when they were winning quite well, even maybe against very challenging opponents in the normal combat system, because they've mastered it. They know how to do combos and work together. And when they get to the new system, they've never done it before, and they're running into trouble. And they're just like, why do we even have to do this system?
Especially if there are circumstances where the stakes are higher in that system, or
Which they often
are. Or circumstances where, say, there's something that your character has an ability that you're like, that really should be able to interact with this. Like, I have a giant inferno fireball. Shouldn't that be a problem for this gas if I cast it on this gas vehicle over here? Or, what if I create a giant field of entangling vines? Shouldn't that be able to slow things down or things like that? And then it's kind of like, oh well, that's not in the rules, so you can't use your usual strategies.
So that's if you do a normal tabletop RPG system and you add a vehicle-only combat. But that's not the only pitfall that exists for vehicles. There's also, we're doing a normal combat, but also there's vehicles, and they have their own thing. Pathfinder 2nd Edition does this. And that adds in some extra complexity that does allow the fiction of, I'm this awesome driver, look at me go, but it leads to some potential drawbacks as well. If you don't have a player who desperately wants to be that driver and have you look at them go, it can feel like it is a burden for whoever in the group is driving the vehicle.
Because they don't get to use their usual
Because they have to spend actions on that. And then, depending on what you're doing, and I'm not talking specifically only about the Pathfinder 2 implementation. There's an infinite number of hypothetical implementations. But if you have a gigantic vehicle that's going to bring everyone around in your tactical combat system fast, maybe much faster than the enemies, you can have a situation where one person's not doing very much other than moving the vehicle, and maybe that does or doesn't excite them. You can have a situation where everybody else is getting tons of free movement, possibly so much movement that the enemies can't even keep up with them. To give an example of how movement is so important in tactical combat systems, especially ones with grids, even in non-tabletop RPGs, like in tactical RPGs, usually movement and added range are the two most powerful things you can put on a unit, because not being somewhere where you can be attacked is one of the best strategies in those tactical RPGs.
Yeah.
Similarly, in D&D 5e, if you have more reach than a melee opponent and over twice their movement speed, then you can just go in, smack them, and go out, and they will not be able to reach you basically ever.
Yeah.
If you have more than 4 times their movement speed, then more than twice their movement speed, they could dash up to you in theory in 5e, and then they would get an attack of opportunity against you when you ran away. With more than 4 times their movement speed, they can't even do that, because even if they dashed up to you at maximum, they would not reach you. And that's if you had to move that way on your own. If somebody else is moving a vehicle for you, you only need to have more than their movement speed. That much lowers the requirement to prevent a situation where you can ever be caught up.
So if the encounter is PCs in a vehicle versus a creature that's not in a vehicle, then you're going to want to make sure that creature is something that they need the vehicle's powers to deal with. Like, let's say that the PCs are trying to battle against a dragon that they couldn't otherwise handle, and the dragon's flying so fast that otherwise it's like, we can't keep up with the dragon. The dragon's just going to defeat us all. But then they're, flying in some kind of dragon mecha. that's then designed for them to be able to fight things. And then one of the fun things that I like to do when you have these sorts of vehicles is have the vehicle have some kind of onboard armaments that the PCs can activate. So that can let them expand past their normal abilities to do something. Because, you know, Mark was talking about maybe the player might not necessarily want to steer the vehicle. Maybe that doesn't feel as awesome. But if the vehicle has some kind of omni laser cannon that does a lot more damage than what the PCs can normally get at their level, people are a lot more likely to want to do that.
So, one of the other issues, even if there wasn't a game balance concern with how fast things are moving in these vehicles, in a situation where you're playing regular D&D or Pathfinder combats, but there's this vehicle moving 60 miles an hour, so 600 movement speed. Mm-hmm. Even if you're like, okay, I balanced it though. All of the enemies have super long range and they can just attack you anyway, or they're so fast that they can keep up. That second one, or the like everybody's dragons, if you're not playing Theater of the Mind, you're in big trouble, even if it's balanced, because of the fact that your battle map is going to need to scroll off of the battle map constantly. You're going to go through, like, 3 piezo flip mats worth of size every round.
Either that or you're going to have to do something where you're like 1 square equals 100 feet or something like that.
But then you can't even use the squares to figure out like the area of your fireball, which is like, what is the area of your fireball? Some small portion of this square.
So like that, then potentially are you running with 2 maps where you're like, okay, this is the map where 1 square equals 100 feet, and if you're within a certain distance of each other, we can try to use this map to like approximate and stuff like that. It's just messy, for sure.
Definitely. And especially if there's multiple things that are all like 400 feet away, except for some of them are close to each other, then you would need multiple of the zoom in maps. Yeah. And that would be like having lots of these tiny maps and then a mini map that is over top of that.
That's also why, like, when you have vehicle combat systems, you often see them with, if they're dealing with some kind of incredibly high speed, then they probably are going to extract it away to, like, you know, this vehicle moves 6 of these funny squares or hexes or whatever per round, and its range is in a certain number of those. So
but that still only works if you have a new vehicle combat system.
Yes.
It will not work if you bring your vehicles into your TTRPG combat system.
Yes.
So, while it's true in this episode, and we want to make clear that both adding a separate combat system for vehicles such as like the Starfinder, Starship system would be an example of that, and just throwing the vehicles into the regular system, both have rough spots, and I do want to make that clear. However, putting them into the main combat system is the one I often see people more confused by why they lead to rough spots. I think people are more like, okay, this was a different subsystem. We don't like subsystems. That's why it didn't work for anyone that's its own subsystem. Whereas people are often like, I just wonder why. Why are all these tabletop RPGs trying to either don't do vehicles because they are worried about this, or when they do, it always is kind of a little rough? And the answer is because the design goals of these vehicles are going to always need to be trying to pay attention to gameplay possibilities in terms of not just balance, but also like the realities of how big your battle map can be, narrative expectations, and beyond narrative expectations, the way that people just can believe that a vehicle would work.
Rising starts talking about the multiple perspectives of like the decks of the ship and then the giant range. That's an interesting one that you can do too, where, for example, when the vehicles are at very long range from each other, it's a vehicle combat. Then once they close enough together, then you can start being like, here's the deck of this ship, here's the deck of this ship. This is the range at which the things that PCs have as character abilities are going to be active.
Yes, and Rohit points out zone-based RPGs can do vehicles well. Yes. Theater of the Mind, ones that don't have ranges or areas. Yes. Ones that are entirely narrative and don't have tactical combat where you just kind of describe what you're doing. Yes. In fact, that last one can lead us into one of the possible solutions for vehicles that can make it not a rough spot. The problem is, all of these solutions will potentially infuriate or enrage some percentage of people because it will do not do what they want from vehicles. So, here's solution number 1. You create vehicles such that they work similar to something else that you already know works. So either you make a personal movement buff that is balanced with other personal movement buffs, but says that you are in a vehicle. So you're like, okay, I found a feat that's in this game that gives X amount of bonus movement speed at level Y. I'm going to create a new feat for my new class that loves vehicles that says you get X amount of movement speed at level Y because you don't gain it, but you have this vehicle that's speed is equal to your speed plus X. And do you have to do anything special? No, it totally can just turn around and whatnot and go backwards at full speed and turn. And it uses all the same rules as nothing else. You don't make piloting checks. It just is the same as walking around, but you can say you're on a vehicle. Similarly, you can do that as a replacement for a mount as well.
So, advantage to this solution is that it definitely isn't going to break any rules because it didn't introduce any new rules.
And it's not going to annoy people about the rules and be like, there's friction. Why are these rules different? Why are these rules messing us up? Why are we having to spend on the other actions? Why are our maps not working? What's going on with the balance? Your gameism is immaculate. Your narrative is given up.
Yes. Because at that point, you're like, okay, you're not telling the story of the person who's on an awesome motorcycle. You're telling the story of the person who's on a moderately faster Segway.
Yes, more or less. Maybe at best, something that's as fast as a horse.
Yeah, and also if they are slower, then it somehow mystically slows down too.
Yes, it's because of the fact that they are not able to push the pedal of the motorcycle as well.
Or so it just gets, it definitely...
I mean, if you use it like a horse, then it would be that you have to slow the horse, so you slow the motorcycle. You could do that, where you create a animal companion style motorcycle stat block, you give it the same speed as a horse. So yes, I command my motorcycle using the command a motorcycle action.
Yeah.
And then the motorcycle moves. And it will move you quite a lot, because so do horses. Not as much as an actual motorcycle would, but you could just say, yes, this is how it works. You want to attack the motorcycle? Great, it's got these motorcycle stats. Heck, it's mindless. It's immune to a bunch of stuff. It's a motorcycle. You could do that.
The motorcycle, it's mindless, but the motorcycle doesn't necessarily doesn't have strikes then, and isn't going to be doing things independently, but it is fast.
Maybe it has a run 'em over strike.
Yeah.
And that it can only use as part of its run 'em over action. That's a 2 action where it moves and it does a motorcycle body strike against them because you ran them over and you put it in there. You could do it with the mount rules. Probably from a gameism perspective of making sure that it works within the game, that nobody's got friction or frustration from a game mechanic perspective, that's the best way. But from a narrative perspective, it can have people throwing their hands up in frustration. Plus, it's never going to give you, the tank that nobody can be attacked inside because it's a tank and it brings 16 characters with it or something like that and then shoots out a giant cannon because at this point, it's balanced with an animal companion. We're going to convey a single person and it's going to follow those rules. Or maybe you should say a construct companion from the inventor class.
Yeah, but if you wanted to be getting into the thing of, I'm the tank or the siege tower or whatever, fundamentally, the tank or the siege tower isn't going to be engaging in real combat against things that aren't roughly as powerful as the tank or the siege tower. You could tell a story about a time that, the PCs get a tank or a siege tower and are able to wreck for a while before the enemies retaliate, or the opponent comes in with a tank or siege tower and the PC's goal is to evacuate people or run away or something like that, and things are handled more in a chase system type situation rather than a true combat situation.
Right.
In the same way that sometimes adventurers will talk about a monster that's way too high level for you, and the goal is just survive and get away. Combat is not feasible.
So the chase system is an example of the opposite of this. We'll just make it be a movement speed buff or an animal companion, and that is fully narrative with vehicles, where you're just like, okay, we're not even doing regular combat. This also could potentially include a very narrative-focused vehicle combat system, or just using another system like chases, like Linda said. The problem that you'll have if you're in a very rules-heavy tactical tabletop RPG and not already in a narrative tabletop RPG, in which case you didn't have this problem in the first place, is that players tend to really not like it when, as we said before for vehicle combat systems, when they can, like, lose in these narrative vehicle-based subsystems that often have high stakes because you're using vehicles, so multiple party members might be in the vehicle, or it's usually at a major moment, when they think their characters could have won and you didn't do the special vehicle thing. So if you're going to use a heavily narrative segue for the vehicles, you may want to consider just kind of making it incredibly easy. Like, almost unlosable, just kind of like a cutscene that maybe has a few die rolls in it. Even if your group normally likes extremely tactical, extremely difficult combat using the regular combat system, because this is not the regular combat system that they signed up for.
Yeah, this is not, because you don't, in those kinds of skill challenges, it's down to, what is the luck of the dice, right? Because you don't necessarily have as many choices that you're playing into. You are much more likely to just sort of succeed or fail based on fortune. I mean, there's some degree to which you can, like, pick which skills you roll or what kind of thing depending on how it's set up. But one thing that the chase does do, though, is that it does create a natural zone-based system, like we were talking about before, where things can overtake or undertake. Another thing that you can consider doing for that is, rather than making it super easy for the best possible result, make it so that the thing that is difficult is getting the excellent result, but the PCs are extremely expected to get a result that's at least, okay, we made our basic goal here. Because if what they miss is an extra bonus opportunity, people are generally going to be a lot less bothered by it if what they miss is one of their characters is in dire straits now because of the results of the dice.
Now, one of the issues, in addition to the fact that your gamist players may just really, really dislike using the narrative one, and that your players who care more about narrative or some kind of feeling of their own verisimilitude of realism may not like your gamist solution, is that also just some people very specifically want that awkward hybrid, and that is what they want. Like, they're like, no, I want to be using vehicles that go at this ridiculously high speed and all this other thing, but I want to be using the regular combat system where my class features and abilities and spells are also coming into it, combined with the vehicle. I don't want one that goes all the way one way or all the way the other way. I want it in the middle.
And that makes it a lot trickier for the GM to create encounters that are actually, say, a fair moderate encounter for the group, because if the PCs have a turbo tank, even if they're lower level than the creature, it could easily become a trivial encounter because the resources that they have at hand to use are so much higher.
And even if it's not a turbo tank that they have to fight through to even hurt the PCs, even if it's just some kind of vehicle that moves at a speed of 600...
Yeah, then that's going to have really powerful effects on the difficulty of the encounter.
Most encounters will no longer have any challenge if you can move at a speed of 600.
Or they're going to be reduced to a small number of chances for things to go horribly wrong.
Worse, in some ways, depending on if your group cares about overall challenge or everybody having fun, having the giant vehicle that has your whole party in it that moves at the speed of 600 and is constantly moving away from the enemies might mean that literally only the people who can attack at a range of, let's say you have fireballs which go at 500 feet. Maybe the wizards are throwing their 500-foot spells. All of the fighting characters are using, like, bows at their maximum range increment with massive penalties, even if they're melee fighters. And some of the characters who don't have bows literally can't do anything.
Yeah.
And are just like, well, I guess my monk just sits here.
Yeah.
Because if I rush off the vehicle, I'm dead. Because all of the encounter will just fight me while the vehicle runs away.
I want to go back a second on the one about the sort of zone-based narrative combat, Rohit was mentioning that if the consequences are more narrative, like you reach the destination slower, or the upcoming combat is more difficult, as opposed to, you know, you have some kind of horrible injury. One thing that really says that to our group, it was kind of like the one of the memes of our group was Jade Regent Caravan Combat, which had an ability to get hurt really badly in a way that was very persistent.
Was my modified Caravan Combat as well. The original Jade Regent Caravan Combat, well, Nelly, it was very different. There was no way that you could get persistently hurt in that Caravan Combat, but you were guaranteed to TPK in about book 3 or 4 unless you used loaded dice that constantly rolled nat 20s and your opponents rolled nat 1s, because the numbers were against you to that extent, where it was like you couldn't hit them except for on a 20. They always hit you except for on a 1, and they would kill you in like a very small number of hits, and you needed a lot of hits to kill them.
So like I really liked that system from like a game.
Linda really liked the one that I created that is not similar to the original one, and that nobody who is watching this knows what it's like in any way. But keep going.
Yes. So I know they don't, but anyway, I'm saying that I really like that from like the overall gameplay perspective, but the idea, even for me, the idea where, and our group would joke about like, oh man, that person has a broken bone. They must have been in caravan combat, because that there was a bit of dissonance there between the kinds of consequences that you could gain in regular combat versus the kinds of consequences you could gain in this
mass combat.
In this mass combat, different sort of situation. So it can create sort of a like, what is it about caravan combat that suddenly, it's so much worse than getting a critical hit that reduces you to 1 hit point?
It was also funny for our group because we were playing a different AP where a character came in, an NPC at the beginning, who was missing a leg after being a caravan guard, and they were like, of course it was after being a caravan guard.
Yeah.
It's caravan combat. But the point is that the more you make your subsystem dissimilar from the original game, the more difficult it's going to be, and the more friction. That's an example of friction that you can experience. Because usually nobody's going to protest the idea that it's possible in war or in combat to get an injury that takes a while to deal with.
But if you can't, if you can, if you can walk through a raging inferno and be cut in half by an ogre, and then like be swallowed and then spat out by a dragon, and then like the cleric casts heal, and 12 seconds later you're back to full and you have no lasting effects, whereas like this one thing doesn't. So because I feel like if it was a system where those kinds of injuries were more commonplace and just baked into it, then it wouldn't have felt weird.
And that's another one of the reasons why going for the sort of narrative solution where you make another subsystem can wind up getting you in trouble, depending on your group. Now, in general, while people like to joke about it in our group, nobody had like a problem with using that subsystem.
Yeah.
Whereas in some groups, they will have a problem. There's been many examples of subsystems, not only with vehicles, but with mass combat, which vehicles often entail because of the fact that they put lots of people in each vehicle, where they would be notorious for being hated in organized play adventures whenever a mass combat was coming, and just like some very visceral responses about authors of mass combat adventures would be posted in reviews.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, sometimes the authors were just like, had to take some gallows humor about how negative of the things that were said, where it's just like, in order to avoid being demoralized by this, it's just like gonna have to be okay. That's what people said.
Yep.
So basically the idea, the crux of the situation, is that when you take vehicles beyond a way to just get from place to place and make them into part of fighting, you're going to run into the narrative and expectations and the fantasy and the wish fulfillment of what a vehicle is, as well as the other rules that are in your system. And when you do, no matter what you do, it's going to create friction unless as Dustin in our chat for our Discord, tiny.cc/arcademark said before the episode started, if you do a tabletop RPG that's entirely about vehicles, you can get around it. Or one that's so narrative that the idea of using a vehicle is already similar to one of our suggestions for going to the extreme, because it's just like, what do you do on your turn in this very narrative tabletop RPG? You just claim what you did and roll a die. And so I am the BMX bandit, and I'll always claim that I was using a vehicle when I rolled the die, whereas Linda's angel summoner, she'll always claim that she was summoning angels when she rolls the die. And in that case, then using vehicles is easy, because literally it's not different than what the other person is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you're, a home GM and you're taking a look at this, it's absolutely worth chatting with your players to figure out what is it that they would want to see out of vehicles. Because if you have a group where people generally want to see the more narrative version versus like the more gamey version or things like that, then you can figure out what sort of style you should use for your group.
Yeah, and as Nick Tarek mentions in chat, ship combat can especially exacerbate some of the same problems that people have with vehicle combat for like land-based vehicles, especially since, unlike land-based vehicles, unlike space vehicles that are in space, when you're on the ocean and you fill the other people's vehicle full of holes, it tends to sink to the bottom. And that combines everything else we said so far with the visceral hatred of 1,000 suns that many players have for their treasure, in quotes, getting lost.
Yes.
And when that ship sinks, inevitably some of the treasure, some of which is like the ship, which are usually pretty valuable, going down. Like, when Linda and I were doing Skull and Shackles, the PCs had a ship combat strategy, which was to have a super fast kitey ship that would distract enemies into shooting at us while we weaved and dodged and never attacked with siege weapons, thus allowing our sort of marine sea to ship infiltration teams to infiltrate a ship and then defeat like 10 or 20 to 1 odds to just take over the ship on the ship without harming the ship.
Also using strategies like control water to raise and lower water levels to make sure, again, that your ship didn't engage.
That the treasure couldn't get away.
Yes.
That's correct. And so basically those pirates did everything in the they you know what? They didn't stop the ship-to-ship combat system from happening. It happened. But they did everything in their power to make sure they were only passive in that system, and that the attacks that were being made were in the other system.
Yeah, well, the question was about ways to make ship combat more engaging. So, for all that we're saying that what we actually did was completely dodging the system, we did have an interesting...
it was like the Fire She Bears Pathfinder 1 ship-to-ship combat system, which had like little spots on the sails where you could damage the sails and other things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a pretty interesting idea to divide the ship into different sectors where damaging it in different sectors could have effects, and that one had a lot of rules too for... do I want to build a ship with a reinforced Darkwood hull? It'll be slower, but it'll have more armor and things like that. So I
think Darkwood hull was fast.
Or faster,
I think the Andromeda had a Darkwood hull.
I thought it was right. Okay, I had it the wrong way, but there were like maybe it was like
there was
the
like the adamantine hull or something like that.
So there are ways that you could decide how to do combat trade-offs for your ship, and then also you had mechanics where it's like, okay, if your ship gets a hole in it, that doesn't mean, you're immediately sunk, but that does mean that maybe you're going to need to spend more resources on having people patch up the ship and then try to escape or do other things like that.
Yes. So even though the group, I would say mostly dodged the ship combat, but not completely, because there would be a defensive ship combat action going on while the other PCs engaged and tried to win not using ship combat. It was still a satisfying use of it, because the degree to which the PCs had to make sure their ship was able to sort of tank was kind of satisfying and felt fair as a cost to the strategy of then sneaking on board the other ship.
And then you can have kind of like the sort of cold shot type thing mechanic where it's like, oh yeah, where you might see it's like, okay, yeah, you shoot the opponent in the arm and it gives them this kind of thing. If you have a ship with sectors, you can say, okay, if you hit the ship in the sails, then it's going to mess with their speed, or if you hit the ship in this particular part, it's going to mess with whatever. So you can have a dynamic system of debuffs based on what you're hitting. Also, when you get to when the ships get into closer proximity, there can be interesting things with them. The ships moving a little bit closer or farther apart, or with the way that people get in between the ships. What does it take to? Can you swing across the ship? Can you drop a gangplank? Can somebody pick up that gangplank and throw it off? You're going into hostile territory when you board a ship.
Absolutely. So, if you want to make vehicles not be a rough spot in your tabletop RPG combat, what should you do? There's a few things you can do. The easiest way is to not have vehicles in your tabletop RPG combat, but that's sort of the glib answer to that question. So, as we've indicated here, the next thing to do is talk to your players. That's when you get to find out if you have any players who are very, very stuck to one of the two sides of vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also get to find out if you're in the lovely situation where one of your players is stuck on one side and one is stuck on the other side, in which case you're kind of in a bind and there's nothing you can do that's going to satisfy everybody other than kind of do this kind of frictional in the middle strategy like many tabletop RPGs do.
Or have situations where some vehicles are modeled in one way and some vehicles in another. Like, it's like, well...
That could wind up angering both of the players.
Yeah, but I was saying, like, maybe there's one player who really wants to have, like, big mecha combat or whatever is something that can happen at some point, but you don't want to deal with that for any basic vehicle that comes up, so you have like the basic vehicles be more like the horses, and then you still have an opportunity later on for the giant ship to do the big mecha whatever.
So my worry if you did that is, let's say that Alice is just like, no, my motorcycle is not a horse.
Mm-hmm.
My super cycle goes 60 miles an hour, goes 600 feet. That's what I need. I need a special rule system for it. It shouldn't be able to turn on a dime. But, and then you're like, okay, but Alice, would you be okay with a fully narrative version of this? And Alice is like, hell yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bob is like, excuse me, I want to ride on my cycle. And I do not want a narrative system. I just want it to be something that works in regular combat so that my character is BMX Bandit.
Mm-hmm.
That's who I want to be. And you're like, okay, would you be good with this motorcycle animal companion? And Bob's like, heck yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that situation is that if you try to do both of those things, then Alice might just be like, I said no when we said if there should be an animal companion. And Bob is now constantly riding on this thing into the normal combats, using those rules that they already jar me. Every moment that he just backs up, his thing is like nails on a chalkboard, and he's doing it every time. Plus, my character can't even ride her motorcycle during the combats because I'm waiting for these narrative combats. And then you go to the narrative combat, and Bob is like, well, I'm BMX Bandit, baby. So I should be able to do really well in this narrative combat. I spent 12 feats on upgrading my motorcycle companion. I should be way better than Alice at this. Why do I not get to use my class abilities? It's just all narrative, and we're just rolling skill checks now. It shouldn't be on a level playing field.
So I think in that case that maybe the types of vehicles that the two of them have are different, and you try to come with a way to describe Bob's vehicle that could be something that could be, like a short range, like tactical turning motorcycle or something like that, and then Alice has like the Lightspeed Warper motorcycle.
Lightspeed Warper Megazord. You can only call it at this very special moment to fight against kaiju.
So then you can try to find a way to describe them as like, if they have different mechanics, they are fundamentally different vehicles, and one of them is designed to be handled in short range combat, but is definitively slower, and one of them is the super fast vehicle. And then because Bob took feats about being I am the motorcyclist of motorcycles, but Alice, I'm also assuming at this point, expended some kind of resource in having her
I'm going to say she
whatever?
didn't, because you told her she could only use it during special narrative moments that you gave a special subsystem, and she couldn't use it 90% of the time. But the Bob did, because you told him, Bob, you can use yours all the time because yours is just using the normal rules. So that's what I think adds to even more
I
issues.
see what you're saying, because then, like, Bob has invested a lot of character resources in being specifically good at that. Well, then maybe you have challenges that are good for, that are good for the lightning racer, and challenges that are good for the tactical motorcycle, because these tactical motorcycle ones require, that you're moving at a slow pace to kind of turn around carefully, and then you have the ones that are like, okay, but when the challenge is just literally moving ridiculously fast in a straight line, that's what Lightspeed Warper does, because that's what Lightspeed Warper can do. And then you have obstacles of both types that appear in your chasing.
So as you can see, Linda is very good at trying to deal with problems that come up at tables. And if you have as much ability as she does to improvise, you might be able to handle it if you have two extreme players. Fortunately, you probably won't. You'll probably have like maybe one player who's really into vehicles, and they might be willing to accept just one of these two extreme compromises.
More realistically, like, maybe someone's like, man, I don't really like I don't really like when the vehicle appears in the combat as like an animal companion type thing. But Alice is saying that, but Bob was the one who's actually playing the motorcycle character. Then maybe you can still work to figure out like some adjectives you can throw on Bob's vehicle to explain why it's particularly good at maneuvering, why it can turn on a dime but is slower than normal or what have you from a narrative perspective. And then, but still, like, Bob is the one who's playing the rider in that case. Or, conversely, if Bob is like, man, I really want to make sure that you can, like, use them in the tactical grid combat, but Alice is the one who's like, well, Alice is the one who actually has the character who has the super light speed warper motorcycle or whatever. I guess you can just call it a normal motorcycle at that point because you're not comparing it against anything. Then, Bob isn't the one whose character is about the thing, and so Alice's opinion holds more weight. Because your example there had...
in my example, the problem was that Alice and Bob both wanted to do a motorcycle all the time, but you were only able to... Because you had to accommodate both of them, you were only able to accommodate Bob most of the time.
Yes, that's correct. But I'm saying that in most cases, maybe you have people with different opinions on how they'd like to see it happen, but only one of them is like, I actually really want my character to be a motorcycle rider is their core concept.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
You could have that. The interesting one is when you have a situation where one person just kind of like doesn't feel that strongly about it, but has the character, and another person is the one who is just like, this grinds my gears. Mm-hmm. Like if Bob was the motorcycle person using the it's like, I don't feel that strong. I just love motorcycles. This is great. This works like a horse normally does. I don't care. I'm on a motorcycle. Mm-hmm. I love motorcycles. And Alice is just like, this is not how motorcycles work. Mm-hmm. This is not how they go. No. Every time I see this, it makes me want to rip out my hair. And you're like, okay, what adjectives can I put on it? He's like, could you call it like the crummy fake cycle that turns fast? It's like, no, Bob would not want us to call it the crummy fake cycle that turns fast.
Okay, well, Alice is being a jerk at this point, but more realistically though, maybe you describe it as like this isn't powered by a gas engine. This is powered by magic, and because it is powered by it doesn't move as fast, but it is easier to maneuver.
It's called a magicycle.
Yes.
And what if Bob is like, I kind of wanted a motorcycle. That's all that I care about. I don't care what you say that it is. I just want it to be a motorcycle. Does it have to be a magicycle?
Well, maybe motorcycles in that setting are powered by magic.
And then Alice says, well, if it's using a motor, though, and it's motorized...
How long until I can kick Alice out of my game?
That's it. Alice gets kicked out. And that's your answer, folks. Even with the patience of Linda, who has been trained and has a master in education, if you kick Alice out of your game, then everything works.
Well, when you had her be like, you have to call it a crummy cycle or I can't have fun, it's like... Calm down.
So, as you can see, you just kick the high verisimilitude player out of your group with the Linda solution, and then anything will go with vehicles.
It was only when you, like, started making her, like, periodically insist that, like, Bob's vehicle was called something that made it sound terrible.
The funny thing is that I feel like that's not that unrealistic for someone whose gears are so ground by the idea that someone might actually suggest something like that. Just based on my reading of different groups' social contracts breaking down in tabletop RPGs that I've read about online, I feel like that's not outlandish enough that it would never happen.
No, more realistically, like, if somebody's like, you have to call it the poo cycle or I can't have fun, then, like, it's time to step back because things will be getting too heated, and you can say, all right, well, we know that there's something unusual about this conveyance, and let's figure out what it's called later. But for now, this is how it mechanically functions. Maybe we can brainstorm some ideas for what it can be called between sessions and find something that everybody's cool with.
You go.
I mean, yeah, more realistically, like, assuming that these are people that you know or care about, you know, you're probably not just going to want to be like, you're not going to be thinking like, Alice is in a bad mood today, banished, or like, Bob is being super particular today, ejected. You're going to want to be like,
gone,
okay,
Bob. Bob is like, I just wanted a motorcycle.
Yeah, you're going to want to like try to figure out why are they so heated about this.
Alice got really mad. I just wanted a motorcycle.
Yeah. And again, the problem and the solution are people.
Yeah, just like in most of our episodes, the problem, the source and solution to all problem is people. I do want to say though that, like,
I do feel like I don't want to give people the impression that that GMing is naturally going to involve you running into a lot of circumstances where people are as extreme on opposite ends is the hypotheticals that Mark likes to throw at me, and it's like, what if one person was like, if my character can't fly 1,000 feet per round and have a jet engine mounted to their back, then I can't have fun. And the other person is like, if jet fuel exists in your world, then I will literally combust.
Now, Linda says this, but she literally had a public PFS table, and all the other players who were there can back me up, where a guy said that if he can't use a combination of feats with a questionable interpretation to just automatically tie a creature up and make them helpless on his turn, such that they would be coup de grace by another player on the next turn and automatically killed, that he didn't have a character he could play at her table. And then she said, then I'm sorry, see you later.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's more parodical than the things that you said there. And it really happened.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think of when I say the person who can't have fun.
Yes.
Like...
So, it can really happen.
Yes.
It probably won't happen to you.
Yes, but I've jammed
you who are watching.
Many groups at this point.
It probably won't happen to you. So, this is kind of more like a worst case scenario. Yes, David Nielsen, who's watching this episode, I believe you were there for that. That particular story. So, that is basically what we wanted to talk about in terms of vehicles and why they become a rough spot in tabletop RPG combat. I hope that answers the question for a lot of people who've often been asking it and been like, sometimes it's not as like aware of the meta as asking it that way, and it's more like, why can nobody get vehicles right in tabletop RPG combat?
It's hard.
It's because literally the pressures on vehicles are contradictory. That's not to say that any one vehicle combat system is bad, or to defend any one vehicle combat system that be like that it couldn't be better than it is. But they have so many pressures that you only with knowledge of your own group and heavy communication with them can maybe kick-bash your own vehicle system. Otherwise, trying to mix them into the tactical combat system can just wind up leading to a situation where it jars with extra friction.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but, you know, on the other hand, vehicles do offer a cool opportunity to really switch things up. A good excuse to allow the PCs a temporary, a temporary chance to play with a power level that's much higher than normal. And, it's fun to switch things up in terms of the mechanics and in terms of the types of approaches that people can take.
That's true. Think about a lot of video games where there might be like one level or one short stretch where your character is like in a vehicle or some kind of Magitech armor or something like that, but then they aren't for the rest of the game. There's so many ways to use it. The problem becomes that once you've introduced something that exists at all, players are going to be like, I can use this all the time. And that's where you have to try to figure out how you're going to adjudicate it.
Yes. And ideally, then, if it's something that you only want them to be able to use occasionally, there's a good reason why they can't always have access to it. Like, for example, you're doing something that's involved with ship combat, but the PCs don't own this ship. They're on the ship for they're on that ship because they're going from point A to point B, and then pirates attack or whatever have you.
Yep.
So they can't just always go back to that, or they have they've activated this, like a certain PFS scenario, they've activated this ancient technology that causes them to be inside of this giant vehicle type thing creature, and then they've got all these additional powers or whatever. So if there's a good reason why this isn't something that they can just say, and now that why can't I solve every problem with this tool that is so much more powerful? Does the vehicle take some kind of fuel that you have just enough of to handle this one thing, and then after that it's like, okay, I've run out of fuel for my Numerian cruiser. I now need to, that was for this encounter.
Does your giant mecha's emblem glow with rainbow colors only when it's available because the GM fiat says that it does, and then you press the button and then transform into mecha
or
mode.
You need to gather the whatever MacGuffinite in order to activate it, and there's not very much MacGuffinite around.
We need Dragon Ballium. Collect them all.
Yes.
So, with that out of the way, everyone, thank you for joining us for Vehicles. Please like and subscribe and hit the bell if you want to see more of this. Join if you want to support us. And vote for next Tuesday's episode, which will be the next episode. We do not have a Saturday episode.
Indeed.
And I will put the vote back up so that you can vote and see.
I don't think I saw any votes come up this time.
I did not. So if you
did vote early, we just missed it, please vote.
Our Build a Monster workshop, where we'll build a workshop right on the episode. Ask Arcade Mark Save My Game Q&A, which is an AMA Q&A for GMs to save their game. Design Diaries, Skills and Proficiencies, talking about skills and proficiencies. Arcade Mark Plays, we'll play some kind of computer game. And how to get into indie TTRPGs, which is not about being a publisher in indie TTRPGs. It's about how to get you and or your group to play indie TTRPGs instead of only playing Pathfinder and D&D and stuff like that. So, vote and find out.
And please vote in real life too, if you were in a place where voting is available in this next week.
In fact, if you are at the point where you're watching our next episode and you haven't voted yet, you're probably, I guess, on the West Coast, and you should get out there and vote and not watch this episode, which looks like it's going to be how to get into indie TTRPGs. Yes, since it has now had a vote change to become unanimously 5, how to get into indie TTRPGs. So.
Yeah, I saw a thing that if you're doing mail-in voting, it's definitely good to get that in sooner rather than later to make sure that things get counted in time.
That's right. So, we will be doing that episode about how to get into indie TTRPGs. And it should be spelled IE indie. So there we go.
Yes, well...
It should be.
It should, but I think it's clear.
But it isn't.
Hey, Kojo's voting tomorrow. Awesome.
Kojo's voting with his daughter. Awesome. So... please vote. We will be totally not, panicking next Tuesday as we talk to you about how to get into indie TTRPGs.
Totally calm. Calm zone.
That's right.
Well, I'm sure folks are going to want to have something that isn't about that day, so.
That's right. We can talk about all sorts of indie TTRPGs there. So, take care, everyone. Have a good week. Have a good weekend, because we won't see you on Saturday, and we will see you on next Tuesday for how to get into indie TTRPGs.